Hi there, my name's Francis Vigent. I'm CEO here at KnowAtom. Today I have my colleague Judy Higgins and Lori Colpoys with me as well. We've all taught with the KnowAtom program and had careers as teachers prior to being part of KnowAtom. Today's book group discussion is focusing on Mindset 2 from Cultures of Thinking and Action by Ron Ritchhart. Mindset 2 is titled, We Can't Directly Teach Dispositions, We Must Enculturate Them. If you are using this as part of a book group that you're doing at your school, we would suggest pre-reading pages 29 to 49 in Cultures of Thinking and Action, which you can get on Amazon as both an ebook or a audiobook or a paperback copy. Along with this recording, we have provided a modified version of the 4C's thinking routine to help you capture your thinking, as well as a copy of the slideshow itself. When you're capturing your thinking, it's best to do so as you're engaged in that pre-reading. The first thing you want to look for is connections with your experience. Second thing, author's ideas you might challenge. Third, concepts worth considering. And fourth, changes that the author is suggesting. And we'll use this a bit as we go through our discussion today. The first bit that we'd like to discuss is really Dr. Ritchart's framing of this entire chapter or mindset, which are two guiding questions. The first being, who are our learners, our students becoming as thinkers and learners as a result of their time with us? Second, what do we want the students we teach to be like as adults? In this quote, a quality education not only fosters rich understanding of the content, but also develops the thinking dispositions one will need for a lifetime. This is not an either or proposition. So with that said, I'd love to open this up for some reflection just amongst our group here today. And I'm happy to go first. These two questions are particularly meaningful for me as I think about my journey as a teacher, sort of moving from my really early days as a first year teacher into somebody who was very confident and high performing and whose students often surprised him. And I see that transition as in a way being guided by some versions of these questions. Something that I was very uncomfortable with early on in my teaching career was giving students work that they didn't see value in and that I didn't really see value in. And what I used to struggle with was feeling like, okay, my kids are doing this work, but so what? And I started my career as a high school math teacher. And so my students would often articulate that, like, why do we need to do this? And I felt as a teacher early on, it's like, well, because we have to. This is school. This is what we do. This is math class. And I felt really unsettled by feeling like it wasn't a good use of my students' time. Like, what could they do better because they engaged in these questions? And oftentimes it didn't feel like it was much. A lot of it early on in my career, I was shadowing teachers that were doing a lot of kind of drill and kill, lots of practice problem sets. And what I wanted my students to be able to do was to act independently, to be able to really use what they learned and to be different people. And so, and I won't go on about this too much longer, but I felt like as I matured as a teacher, that I focus much less on getting work done and much more on what can my students, how will my students be able to act differently or engage differently as a result of having engaged in my classroom in some way. And so I always thought of myself as looking for echoes. Like I wanted my students to engage in something. And then for me, the proof of its value was this kind of echo that I could see them using that someplace else independently. And so I would try to improve the echoes more than engaging in some particular kind of work. So that's sort of my reflection on this. And I don't know if that spurs anything or agree or connections or anything for
I
either of
think
you.
similar. Yeah, I think very similar. I think early on in my teaching, I was much more focused on content than I was thinking dispositions. And I don't know when it sort of switched for me. Hopefully it was fairly early on, but focused more on the process of learning. I definitely had a shift to that. You know, how we were learning, not just what we were learning. And I think that's everything, you know, how to be a learner. And those dispositions are everything. I like that they say it's not an either or proposition, right? You have to have both.
Mhm.
If we could actually move to the next slide, because I'm thinking about an experience I had. Sorry, actually, it was the next slide with a question that I wanted to, this one. Yes, thank you. Sorry, I made us skip a slide. But as I thought about that very first slide that you and Laurie were just talking about, I focused on this question: how do we allow students to develop disposition to the culture we create? And that's when I thought about basically what you both were talking about, is that I focused on, I wanted my students to be a certain thing, but did those things of putting up the signs and talking about it and telling them to be curious and how much fun it was to be curious, but not understanding the work that needed to be done behind that. And I thought about, when I saw this slide, I thought about a classroom that I had watched that was so transformative to me, where these students, they were second graders, and their activity, they were working in groups of 4, and their activity was to look at a series of pictures and decide which seasons these pictures should be in: winter, fall, spring, summer. And the pictures were really great because some of them were clear, but some of them were not clear. And I was kind of wandering around the room, like listening in a little bit. And then this one group really captured me because they were having a really robust conversation about one particular picture. And there was this one girl, and again, remember, these are second graders, who was very determined to get her point across. And there was one particular boy who was very determined to challenge her. And it was remarkable to watch as he kept going back to the picture and pointing out different things about the picture, saying, you know, but let's look at this. And she would kind of push back and say, no, I still think that it's this. And one of the other students questioned her, well, why do you think that? And so they were really taking apart this picture, and it was dazzling to watch. And finally, towards the end, this one particular determined little boy said, well, let's look at it this way. And he pointed out something really small that was going on. And she looked at it. This was such an amazing moment. She said, oh, you're right. You changed my thinking. I think you're right. And it was this moment as a teacher that I was taking so many notes, because I kept noting all that the teacher must have done prior to my seeing this, the work that that classroom had gone through, learning how to have the language of being able to defend your thinking, having the open-mindedness to look at things a different way. Oh, okay, I changed my mind, and be delighted about it. And I actually talked to the teacher because I was like, I am so impressed. And then she turned around and celebrated it and went, oh, Ms. Higgins noticed something that was going on. And so she proceeded to name it, call it out. So both the girl who had changed her mind could feel great, as could the boy who was determined to, I'm really going to push back on this. So it was such a powerful thing for me to realize this isn't going to happen because I want it to. They don't have that language to defend their thinking. They don't know the delight of being curious, because that was the other thing that happened, is everybody in that group was delighted because they were being called out.
Mm.
Normalizing mistake making and
Yeah.
celebrating it too. Big
Yeah.
time.
Yeah. And not even necessarily, it wasn't necessarily a mistake, just a different way of
Right.
seeing things. And that could all feel like, yeah, that's cool. That's normal.
Mm.
Right.
I love what you're sharing, because I'm just going to step back one slide to the one that we jumped over, and even to what we were talking about 1 second ago, where here in the beginning we're sort of talking about a quality education not only fosters rich understanding of content. I could challenge the author to sort of separate these two a little bit. Understanding of content, or just content, period. I guess earlier we mentioned content, and that's what I wanted to call out here was that it's really about understanding. It's the understanding of the content, and that's what it says here. Elsewhere, it just mentions content in the book, but I think that it's really about the understanding of the content, and it's that back and forth way that dispositions get students to develop an understanding. And that's the thing, it's beyond knowledge. It's really this depth of knowledge and this flexibility of knowledge and this disposition to do something with it. And that's, we made this little diagram. I really love the talk and a quote that's here for us. As teachers, we seek to develop students who not only can read, but also who do read. Students who are not just capable of asking questions, but who regularly do so because they're curious, who not only stop and reflect on their learning when they're required to, but who engage in the action spontaneously as they see the need for it. And I think that's a big part of what you're describing, Judy, is that you're seeing these second graders perhaps being required to engage, but the tools and the habits that they're displaying are really dispositions for engaging, and that in this particular chapter on page 31, it talks about dispositions as the bridge, or the mechanism for bridging the ability action gap. And so
like the motivation. Yeah.
Exactly, because I can't tell you how many folks I've taught with over the years, and I felt this myself at times, especially as a high school teacher, starting off as a high school teacher. I mean, that's as an inner city urban high school teacher, where I had students that were my age. They were within a couple months of my age, some of them, and getting them to engage felt like tough. It really felt tough, like almost impossible. And so I think about that as that ability action gap. The kids all had the ability, but they weren't taking the action. And what it says in the text that's not anywhere in our discussion today is that dispositions matter because they tie together observed abilities and skills with future potential and action. And if I was to boil that down, it's that the dispositions are sort of the nature to leap, to take the leap and use the ability to take action. And that's why you see here present understanding and opportunity for further understanding. Oftentimes, students have no understanding, and that's an okay place to be. And the way I think about this in my teaching is that it's if I can create an environment and a culture where we all understand that it's okay to be at zero, but there's an opportunity and we honor and value and promote the dispositions to try to connect, to try to understand, to try to question. And even if we have an understanding like that, the student or both students in your example, Judy, where one student sees something, another student sees something else, if the disposition is to question or to listen and then ask follow-up questions or consider take somebody else's viewpoint for a moment, it creates an opportunity to develop further understanding. And whether that's to dispel myths that other people believe about what we believe, which may be fact, or whether we believe things that aren't supported by fact. And so we're the ones that really, need to, as the little girl said, oh, you changed my thinking, to change our thinking. Like these are all disposition, completely tied to dispositions. So and I'll give others the floor here in a second. When I think about my high school students and others I've taught with at different grade levels saying, but my students can't, but my students don't, it's tied to the environment that I as a teacher was creating and that the teacher, my school was creating for these students. And as a high school teacher, my kids were coming to me with years and years and years of having been in cultures of learning in classrooms in our city that did not create those kind of opportunities, that did not honor and build those kind of dispositions. So it's no wonder to me now, looking back, it's no wonder that students were not taking action to use their abilities to
Yeah, I
cross
was
the
going
gap.
to point out
Yeah.
how critical Judy and that teacher were in that scenario. He talks about, you shouldn't confuse enculturation with simple osmosis. It
Right.
doesn't merely, they don't just merely soak up a disposition. And it's really the teacher, Judy, and that teacher had a very critical role in bringing it to the fore, making it an object of study and an object of reflection for those students. I remember when the growth mindset first came out years ago, and I was all hopped up to read Carol Dweck's book and so enthused to bring it into my classroom. And it very quickly learned that it couldn't just be that I taught them about it. I couldn't just teach them the difference between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. I had to involve them in reflection, and I had to, in essence, part of the classroom through my language and through my actions. And even before I introduced the growth mindset, I involved them in some challenges, just an individual challenge and a group challenge, just so that they had that to reflect on. But then just how intensely I had to continue that discussion through the school year, through, like I said, my actions and my language. Using that mindset language, teaching them to ask for help, leading by example, believing they could, setting high expectations and believing that they had the capacity to grow and improve. All those things are so important. It's not just a matter of sitting back and teaching them, what a growth and fixed mindset is.
Well, and I think that's something that this chapter drove home for me is that, it's the entire title of the chapter, right? We can't teach dispositions. We need to enculturate them. That the knowledge transfer model, that informational learning model doesn't work for dispositions, and students respond to that authenticity. Do you really value this?
Right.
And I think as it relates to No Adam and a curriculum side, and I think sometimes people find this a bit unsettling early on, is that the curriculum's aim is to create an environment of leaping. How do we create an environment where it is safe and encouraged and celebrated for students to leap, to make leaps in connections, or leaps in judgment, or leaps in different things in different ways, and then to own the outcome and to reflect on it and for that to be okay and to be safe and something that we do regularly. Because I think to me, that's what we see here in this little kind of diagram.
Definitely.
So I just want to jump a little bit further on here because I think we're touching on it, and I'm going to just read this real quick. So this is from page 3233. Neuroscientist Dr. Matthias Gruber used fMRI scans to better understand the effects of curiosity on learning, so brain scans. He found that curiosity puts the brain in a state that allows it to learn and retain almost any kind of information, makes the process more rewarding to the learner. Susan Engel has called curiosity the engine of learning. Curiosity helps students make new knowledge and information meaningful. So what can a teacher, and this was one of our framing questions here, but I feel like it's a continuation of our discussion. What can a teacher do to nurture a culture of curiosity and disposition, maybe, of curiosity?
I was really struck in the book where they pointed to some research, and they talked about how despite the importance of curiosity, it's not very robust in schools. And that she noted that children's questions usually drive learning outside of school, but once they're in the classroom, it drops off dramatically, which was a pretty sobering read for me. And then it made me reflect on, oh my gosh, when I was in the classroom, what did I do to nurture that? And I think there's a lot to nurturing curiosity. I think it's a whole host of things, a whole list of things, and it has to be really genuine and authentic to begin with. I think the first thing is just being a good listener and hearing what your kids have to say. I think teachers do a lot, maybe sometimes too much talking. I love that acronym, WAIT. Why am I talking?
Well, and I think also this one too made me reflect on another just amazing classroom, which I was so fortunate to see amazing classrooms because I could question my own, what's missing in my classroom? And I liked the way this chapter kept kind of urging us to look at what do we want to keep? What do we want to modify? What do we want to get rid of? And I thought of a lot of places where, Laurie, it's exactly what you were saying, where I was doing too much talking and not enough of letting them fly, so to speak. And this was a classroom I observed where the students were making sort of a slingshot type thing. And they had materials, and I came in when they were at the point of testing them. So I had missed a lot, but I could tell a lot that was going on in this classroom. And the students would, whenever they were ready, they could go to the center part of the classroom, which was the launch pad area. And students could walk over and watch if they wanted to or not. It was very interesting to me. So they'd have, some students were so engaged in finishing theirs up, they did it. Other students would come over and watch. And there were so many things that were interesting to me. One was there wasn't necessarily a celebration of how far you got it. You just kind of noted it. So there wasn't this competitive thing that I noticed going on. But there was very much like so much conversation around, whoa, why did this go so much further than ours? And a lot of just great conversation. And then there was a lot of like running around after that group, like a group would do it, and then some students who were watching might have a question. The teacher often asked them good questions. So the teacher was definitely modeling, asking some questions about, just whatever, what did you do here? Kind of modeling that. But there was very little of that because this was something, again, clearly they had done a lot of work around that. And it was so much fun for me as an observer to watch as other groups would go to that group and say, bringing theirs and saying, what did you do here? This looks like mine, but mine didn't go very far. So they would literally say, I'm curious about what the difference is in ours. So they were learning from each other in such a robust, exciting way. And it was causing the group who had done it to think about, what did we do? So there's all this conversation going on back and forth that was so much thinking going on when the group who was being approached would have to really think about, let's see, why did we do that? Why did we make those decisions? What is different about yours? And the other thing that was fascinating to me, because this was so much curiosity, there were a lot of different materials to use. And one group that was watching, a group that theirs didn't go very far. And he said, and I just loved bearing witness to this, he said to his partner, I just want to run over and give them a suggestion about how they're go further. And I'm what? How did this happen in this classroom? And he did, he went over and it was accepted, like you had said, Laurie, like normalizing that kind of conversation. They didn't take offense, they were engaged, they were like, I remember them saying, well, actually we tried and that didn't work, and this discussion ensued. So there was so much amazing curiosity, and what I kept coming back to, there's no competition here. They're not, yours is better than mine, and you know, oh, I'm gonna stock off. And there wasn't any one right way to do it. And that was the other exciting thing, is it was very clear that this was not a place where the teacher had modeled, here's what everybody's going to do today. The teacher had modeled, here's what we're interested in. Here's the materials. So, you know, there was a lot behind that. And again,
Normalizing the uncertainty and the not knowing.
yes, the uncertainty, the not knowing, and that there's more than one ways to do this.
Right.
That is just, again, all that thinking, and everybody's thinking is valuable, even though I don't necessarily want to change mine. I have a great idea how you could change yours, so that not learning from the teacher, learning from this incredibly rich environment around you. So, you know, we all talked about what we were missing at the beginning being teachers, and it was just so much of that. I didn't have to be the keeper of how we should do this, or how I think it should look, or even how far I think it should go. That, you know, students knew, like, ugh, mine barely went, like, what's wrong here? They knew how to, that was part of the fun. It wasn't a failure.
Right. Leaving room for that openness, uncertainty, exploration, you know, sense making, just leaving space for it.
Yes, yes. And that excitement. And I think that I loved that point in the chapter where they really sort of named that, is don't take that opportunity away from your students to feel that, oh my gosh, this feels so exciting to be curious and to try something. And I would think about that a lot, as, you know, how often I took that excitement away, that ability to feel, you know, external, that this is what it feels to be a learner. This is what it feels like to discover. This is what it feels like to be curious. That's such a wonderful feeling. And I so often took that away. I ruined it all. Here you go.
I think also that, like, the open-ended questions and questioning answers too. I think a teacher can do so much when you stay away from that IRE, you know, seeking. I mean, there's always has to be some of that, but
Sure.
I just think questions, open-ended, and questioning answers as well can you know, that kids pick up on that, and kids emulate that as well themselves. So probably that teacher is doing a lot of that, I would imagine.
Definitely.
So much I want to add on to here. And Laura, you just mentioned IRE, or some people call it QRE, the question, respond, evaluate sort of model of, we think about that in sort of ping pong type discussions. But my connection here, well, I feel like I have a few, but one being that It's not, what we're talking about here is not an environment where students are trying to get the answer the teacher wants. And I feel like something that we've talked a lot about in the past in other forums is, in relation to No-Atom, is that we're not doing the demonstration so that students then go back and recreate that. And when they recreate it the way we did it, they get their A.
Right.
And that is all too often that knowledge transfer model, an informational model of instruction in the classroom that I don't know if it, and I think about having standards-based instruction. Yes, we're all held to standards, but the standards are multidimensional. They're skills, content, and thinking. And prior sets of standards may have been, depending on what state somebody's from, very fact-focused. So this sort of knowledge transfer model that we're encourage folks to get away from is doesn't have the value that it used to have, because students could memorize facts and pass a test. But by changing the classroom learning environment to be more in line with the standards that we have now, creating this kind of culture that we're talking about, it creates that opportunity, dignity, respect, and reward for authentic engagement on behalf of a student, as I see it, because I feel like a classroom can be, I think about that. I don't know if you've ever been to the fair, and they have those things where, you can pay $5 and you take the big sledgehammer and you hit whatever it is and you try to ring the bell. And I feel like the classroom the traditional informational classroom can feel like that. It's, as a teacher, I'm putting this information out there, and then I'm going to hand each child the hammer and they're going to hit the bell. And when they hit the bell, they pass the, so on, we can check it off. I've covered the standard, and we move on. But it's not about every student hitting the bell to get that particular answer. And I feel like, not just in the research, but in my experience, when students are in that environment, especially as they get older, once they start hitting middle school, they shut down because they don't want to engage and show that they don't know something, or they can't ring the bell the way that we want them to. And
that's
so
the killer of curiosity.
It's the absolute killer of curiosity, right?
Yeah.
There's no opportunity for
focusing
me here.
on right answers, for sure.
Exactly. And so that, and I think, we talked about celebrating a little bit earlier. I mentioned celebrating. How we celebrate and what we celebrate is so important, because I think what we celebrate reinforces what we want. If we celebrate ringing the bell, then that says to every student in there that all I want you to do is ring this bell. And if you can't ring the bell, you're not a celebrated member of our class here. And while that may not be my intention as a teacher, it can be sort of this unfortunate outcome of language, like you were saying earlier, Lori. And I think the type of celebration is, when I think about it in my class, that nurtures curiosity, is sort of celebrating, I would call it novelty. Celebrating different things that we notice, different angles on something, even mistakes, celebrating what we might be able to learn from that, or that we can learn from that, says to students that I value your engagement, I value your thinking, I value your curiosity. And to me, this quote jumped out at me in the book here on page 33. It talks about the frequency of episodes of curiosity. And I think about the lesson routine in No-Atom. The lesson routine in No-Atom, picture thinking, nonfiction reading, engaging in Socratic dialogue or that scientific discourse, students planning, and then using their plans to manipulate and gather data and use that data to come to conclusions. In the book, it says the frequency of episodes of curiosity through questions, direct gazing, manipulating objects diminishes as students progress through school. And this is Engel's research. Her research concluded that the pressure on teachers to cover content leads to discouraging curiosity. Seth Goldberg, author of Radical Curiosity, goes a step further, arguing that our world today has been designed to eradicate curiosity, not just in schools, but in our adult lives. Why does society diminish curiosity when it is such a potent force for learning, motivation, invention, and discovery? Goldberg argues that we move too quickly towards solutions without giving adequate time to develop questions. And I would add to that, reflect and consider, really think, consider others' viewpoints, go below the surface, all of those things we identify as thinking moves. And he even mentions here, businesses prioritize action and decisiveness. Leaders emphasize management of old knowledge over the creation of new. Sounds a bit like schools. If curiosity is linked to our need to explain the unexpected and grapple with uncertainty, where do students have opportunities for this in school? And for me, that I guess kind of drove it home that if all we want is to ring the same bell for every student, we're eradicating curiosity.
Made me think of a teacher I watched who had a routine called My Favorite No. Have either one of you heard about that? She was a math teacher.
No.
Amazing. So she would give them a pretty complex problem and they would solve them on index cards. And then she would sort the cards into yes, basically, yes, you got it right, and no. And then she would focus on the no's and she would pick her favorite no's and she would put them under the document camera. And then they would engage in, collaborative conversation and discussion about the mistake and how they could learn from the mistake and how that mistake actually, would lead to further understanding of this complex problem. So how powerful is that, to call it her favorite no, and talk about a way to celebrate a mistake and to hold up a mistake and the value in mistake making. That was brilliant.
I feel like there's two pieces before we move on from this point discussion is I think worth considering but also challenging is that in the quote that I had just read, it says pressure on teachers to cover content leads to discouraging curiosity. And I think that's worth considering, that a focus on covering content discourages curiosity because I think it drives teachers to ring the bell model because we see a list that we have to check off. But I guess what
feel for teachers with that, though. I so feel for teachers in that dilemma. It just seems like there is so much to cover, but I totally get it, Francis. Like, you can't have that mindset. Well, if you march through the curriculum, they're going to end the year with nothing.
Right. But it's so understandable that this focus on or pressure on teachers to cover content leads to discouraging curiosity, because how else can you sort of mechanize and guarantee that you get through, or you deal with this anxiety? And that's what I'm getting at, is that the pressure on content covering, standards covering, creates an anxiety in teachers that I think causes teachers to revert to a knowledge transfer informational model of instruction. Just because as a teacher, you can see people coming into professional development saying, you know what, I'd love to talk about the big ideas here, but at the end of the day, I need to cover this content. So you need to tell me how do you, like, what do I do? And the difficult answer to that is that you need to create a culture in the classroom that doesn't focus on covering all of this and checking it off. It needs to be a culture that creates an opportunity to actually engage in the phenomena and process this context with thinking, making connections, and all the sort of things that we're talking about. And that's, I guess, where I would challenge the author or the researcher in this case, that it's actually, I think, an administrative leadership failure, because the pressure on teachers is coming from administration, who may feel the pressure of the test, who may, so on and so forth. And I feel like the bigger person, and I don't mean bigger in a condescending way, but I mean the administrator, the leadership needs to look at learning effectively as coming from an environment where curiosity is the engine. And so we need to protect that and we need to encourage it. And how are we going to do that? We're going to protect teachers, and we're going to encourage teachers to be curious and encourage teachers to create these very rich and dynamic environments so that content isn't a list, but content is actually a journey, a kind of grand investigation that unfolds throughout a year. And so we can trust the students and we can trust the teachers that learning is happening and that those standards are quote unquote getting covered, but not in this sort of list, draconian, check it off kind of manner. Because if we as administrators walk into the classroom and say, where's your standard on the board? Where's this? Where's that?
Where's your objective?
Where's your objective? And you were on this last week. Why are you still on it? You need to move on. There's 10 other standards, right, that you need to be dealing with. I think that goes to a very dark place really quickly. And I think it's not just for teachers and job satisfaction and students in learning satisfaction, but I think it's in school performance. And so I think it's shooting ourselves in the foot as administrators. But I think that brings us to the next quote that we have here.
I was just going to ask us to move to that one because
yeah.
I thought this spoke to me so much as a teacher that I don't have the time to be curious because I'm anxious. And so this is sort of talking about we don't want our students to be anxious, but I jumped right to, as a very anxious teacher, I didn't have time or space or the inclination to let myself be curious. How could I do this differently? I loved what I saw in that classroom. I want to try that. No, I have so much to do here. I have so much to cover. The test is coming. And I recognize how much as I became a more seasoned teacher and more confident and more able to see, I know where this is going to go and it's a good place. So if I kind of sneak away from the covering, I'm going to trust that this is going to slow down. This unit's going to take a long time because I have a lot that I want to introduce my students to that's going to impact their learning. And I knew I started to have, like students, I started to have the language to defend what I was doing. So I could say to administration, well, yeah, sure, I put it on the board, all the things, but we're not really going to totally focus on that. So I think that's such an important one to think about, the anxiety that's being created at all levels. And I understand it's at the administration levels too. But I love when you can think about that in every single step. It helped me relate to my students when I could see what anxiety did to my brain.
Definitely.
Yeah, I would second that. Or third. And I guess I love in this quote this concept of playful curiosity. And Judy, you mentioned about slowing down and creating an environment where all of this can happen. It's funny, in my mind, I think of it as even speeding up. It's not always slowing down, because I felt like when playful curiosity and authenticity was really genuine and happening in my classroom as the way, and that's what I thinking
It's
and
like fuel.
it's like fuel. It is like fuel.
Yeah.
It is. It's like fuel, and it's just the way we, in our case, I taught science, so it was the way we engaged in science. When you came through my door, this is what we did. This is how we treated each other. This is how we thought about things. This is how we engaged. And so it was the fuel. If students weren't going to think, or if they weren't going to be curious, or if they weren't going to engage, our classroom was going to screech to a halt. But because those things happen, our class almost sort of sped up. And as a teacher, I became more confident moving on. moving
Mhm.
on more quickly, because I knew that where there were areas of weakness, whether it was within a concept or within a skill, that was something that I could bring into, whether it's discussion or into a focus of formative feedback or whatever, I could bring that into our next lesson, our next unit. So it wasn't that once and done, ring the bell and move on content coverage. And so I guess I just want to offer that as a, at the very beginning of the year, it felt very slow because I would be laying groundwork in the sense of, this is the expectation when you come in here. And so for students, they had to get to a point where they really believed me that was the expectation. And especially if they were coming from experiences in other grades that it was about ringing the bell. But as soon as that sort of basic habit and expectations were understood and everything, it just, for me, I felt like the second half of the year moved 4 times faster than the first half. But
Definitely. And I think, but what I think was important is recognizing where they talk about, for a disposition, there needs to be ability. And that was one of those slow down when I realized, oh, they don't actually know how to ask questions. So I
right.
have to slow that down and provide some assistance so they understand. And that, again, as a teacher, having to recognize, I have to see what are the steps. And I think that ringing the bell, I really like that one, because not everybody's got that ability / strength to ring the bell. So what do we do for that? What needs to come in to give them the ability to get from point A to point B?
Mm-hmm.
There was really a shift when I started teaching with no Adam, and I think science lends itself beautifully to that anyway, but just celebrating, like you said, that playful curiosity, celebrating their wonderings and their questions. And they didn't have a lot of wonderings and questions when I first used the program. And it was really something I had to encourage and bring out in them. But once you do it, it's like fire on, oil or gasoline on a fire, it quickly spreads.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And it's interesting because I think there's 2 ways to view ability. I think, and I think, Judy, you're touching on something really deep here. It's so when I hear the word ability, my mind goes directly to almost like a cognitive level where I'm like, are all students able to learn? And my answer is immediately yes. I know all kids can do this, but I feel like there's another way to think of ability, which I think is what you're talking about, is to have my students developed a skill or a disposition or a foundational piece of knowledge that's necessary in order to build off of in some way. So, for example, if it was a class in foreign language, if a student doesn't know the vocabulary word in that language, there's no way to use that word. You actually need to know it in order to use it. In the case of science, it might be, if you don't know what the marks on the side of a beaker are and what the numbers represent, then measuring is going to be very difficult. Or how to take an average. If you want to look at the difference of an average, you might need to slow down, do a mini lesson on averages, and yet make concessions, because in science, doing long division with decimals in 3rd grade for averages is not necessarily where we want to go with this. But to use a calculator to understand the big concept and to take the time to do that mini lesson and then be able to use it could be very valuable and appropriate. And so that does take slowing down to help them get that piece so that they can engage the opportunity and make the leap. And so thank you for pointing that out. I wanted to bring this next slide up. We had highlighted this quote: "We don't learn from experience, we learn from reflecting on experience. Teachers must bring dispositions to the fore so that they can be an object of study and reflection. This may mean students regularly self-assess and teachers comment and give feedback on students' development of dispositions." And one of our reflection questions here is, how can routines play a role in students giving and getting regular formative assessment?
When I think of that quote, self-awareness is self-regulated learning. And what teacher doesn't want a learner that can self-regulate and adapt different strategies? And, that's everything. How can routines play a role?
I went right to thinking about what we do in No Adam, which is checkpoints, where you're checking in with the students know exactly at what point do they stop, come, get some quick feedback. And that was another place that I learned so much from that, because as a teacher, I recognized I was often like, if things seemed to be going well, like, let's just keep going. They seem to be going well. And then once we got to a certain point, I would maybe check in on a group and realize, oh, they're really far off. They're not even really understanding the question that was being asked. And when I started using checkpoints and recognizing that on a regular basis, I'm checking in, asking a few quick questions, I'm getting a good read on where they are. They're getting a good read on where they are. And there's that opportunity we need to shift here. And I liked that so much, because some students, it may take a minute. They're on the right track. They all seem to be understanding. The group is working as a group, so I can release them to move on to the next step, which is very powerful for them. You've got it. You're ready to move on. Another group maybe one team member is doing all the work and the others are just following along, or they really don't understand where they're going, that I can help them. Where do we back up? Where do you need to do something different, fix something? So you're giving them that support. You're helping them to I'm helping with assessment, but they're also assessing themselves, and they have some sense of where did things go awry before it goes so awry that we have to spend a lot of time backing up and figuring it out. So I think that when students know this is a regular routine, there's just much more caretaking, I think, with a student to know, one, the student's going to check in with the teacher's going to check in with all of us. So we've got to be doing this as a group. It's all of our responsibility to make sure. So much goes on when you have routines that students are aware of. It's not your secret when you're going to jump in. And I think that also, I underlined this a million times, because this was such a great that I take away from me as a teacher, just asking that question, talk to me about what you're doing. That's just such a powerful question that helps you so much. And it's I liked this chapter so much because I felt like there are so many, they're simple, but they're hugely deep, but they're very simple. Hand that to a teacher and you're handing a teacher so much. Here's a great question to ask. And
we're not only, and by saying that, Judy, how great for you as the teacher, but how great for the kid as well when you say that to them, because they have to think about their own, that's a way of processing their own thinking. So they're making it visible to everybody. And think about all the parts of the lesson routine in No Adam, the picture thinking routine or Socratic dialogue, all those things are just ways to make that thinking visible. And to me, when you're talking, that's a way of thinking. That's the biggest way of thinking, I think, is for a kid to talk. And I don't think kids sometimes have, I think like it goes back to that, wait, why am I talking? Give
Yeah.
the kids the floor
Yeah.
to talk.
Mhm.
And that's also that ability for students to, to either recognize, wait, I don't know what I'm talking about. Let's, back
Yeah.
up. Or, oh, wait, and then you have that wonderful thing where students start jumping in and helping each other. Well, we talked about this. And that is that making thinking visible to themselves, like really
Mhm.
naming it. This is what it is to think, isn't,
Mhm.
this is very cool.
Mhm. That's what I love about routines is, in a sense, it's almost makes a game out of thinking, and
Mhm.
it creates a structure. It's really a structure for that playful curiosity we were talking about earlier, where if a child has never really been engaged in an academic context using playful curiosity, we can, in a sense, play a kind of game by providing the structure where we can understand sort of the rules and the boundaries of the routine. But within that, we can have infinite not just curiosity, but infinite creativity.
Mhm.
And what we notice, uh, for example, is may have value, has value. It's honored at least. And what I love about this quote, and I might even take exception to it a little bit, and I'll kind of explain that 1 second, is that it's so the picture I get, particularly in the very beginning of this quote, is we don't learn from experience, we learn from reflecting on experience. I think about in our program, for example, we have Lexile certified nonfiction readers, right? So it's not uncommon for teachers to approach those by just reading them aloud to students, and oftentimes, talking about underlining the big ideas and so on. But oftentimes the feedback that comes back is that the kids aren't learning what they're supposed to learn from that. And often my question is, well, what are they supposed to learn from it? And what is their opportunity to really engage and connect? And that's usually where the conversation goes in a new direction. And we talk about picture thinking routine, and picture thinking routine being that thing, this thinking routine that No Adam has as a support, where we ask students not to have read anything, but to look at the images on the page, identify one object, one action, one property, and then say what they think we might learn about on that page. Then they share them out, we read, and then discuss what the page is really about and the connections we had. And the results are completely different. Uh, Oftentimes, when the teacher who said kids weren't engaged, they weren't getting anything out of the reading, then goes and tries picture thinking routine with students, they say, oh my gosh, they're like different kids. They're so engaged. They're noticing all these things. I'm really surprised, the connections they're making. And I think that it speaks to this quote because we can we can experience the reading by just having it read to us. But the real reflection on the experience, I think, starts with connecting. And I think about that picture thinking routine as a routine or framework for connecting with the images and trying to make sense of the things that we notice. But then whether the teacher reads the page aloud or the student reads the page aloud or however it happens, we're reflecting on what we experience in those images, the connections we made to our own personal lives, and try to make sense out of them. So again, it turns the reading into reflection right
Mhm.
from the beginning and not from sort of just this kind of more passive experience. And I think that whole routine brings that disposition of taking intellectual risks and making leaps in meaning and in connection and judgment to the forefront. So that's what this is talking about, and really studying the objects and what we see in their connections. So um, I think that that's just one example of how a routine can get students giving feedback and reflection, but also getting feedback, not necessarily directly from a teacher either, because in hearing the connections that are made and by other students, hearing what happens when that text is read aloud, and then the sense making that goes on is all, it's all feedback of sorts. And it's an assessment of sorts. And to Judy, your point, I think it's, as a teacher, it gives me a lot of insight into the world of my students and what they think, and gives them insight into what their peers think and what they connect to. And so it's this really just amazing opportunity. I don't know if either of you, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to add something quick because I know we have to move on. Yep. But I think that the picture thinking, and this was what I saw, was that when I did the reading to my students, it wasn't something they valued. They weren't listening. And when I started doing picture thinking, that created that value because my students were suddenly eager to listen. And was my thinking like,
they had skin in the game.
Yes, exactly. And I'm looking for that moment when like, yeah, I said that, or I noticed that. And that to me, it's that value piece that is so important. Is this something? And when I was just reading, I would say maybe, 10, 20% were really listening. So they couldn't even reflect on anything because nothing was happening. But adding in, yeah, Laurie, that's such a good way of putting it, of they had skin in the game. It's like, now I'm perked up and I'm valuing this and I'm really engaged in seeing how do my thoughts matter within this reading.
And I think that brings us back to this like greater question is what is the culture we're creating in the classroom so that students that, how do they know that their thoughts matter before they offer them? And so I think that connects us to this next slide here, which we had picked out this quote: when students are a part of a culture that sends messages about the value of thinking and that supports its development, then students are more likely to take on those values. Likewise, when beliefs about knowledge and the processes used to build understanding are regularly modeled, supported, and expected, and I think thinking routines are, ding, 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 model, support, and expect thinking, then students come to take on and internalize these beliefs. I feel like, I don't know if either of you want to continue the discussion around this, or if we want to pivot into these questions. I feel like you both shared elements that connect here.
When I think about what messages, I know when I was teaching, I started the year, this sounds counterintuitive to like what we were talking about, but I would share, it was kind of like a poster, but hear me out. It was about my beliefs about learning and teaching. And it had all kinds of things on it. Everyone is capable of high achievement. And I know this sounds like I was just sitting there talking at them. But I would take one at a time and sort of reflect and discuss it. It was things like it's intelligent to ask questions and to ask for help. That's the way we learn. It's okay to make mistakes. Challenges are good. They make your brain grow. All those things. But I began the year by sharing them as my beliefs. Like, this is what I believe in, and this is how our classroom will work this year based on these beliefs. But it wasn't enough for me to do that at the beginning of the year. I had to, walk the talk. And like I was saying with growth mindset, it had to be reflected in language, had to be reflected in action. They had to be things I truly believed, or they weren't going to go anywhere. It makes me think of what's on the next slide, is that we slap up something, our vision, up on the wall and call it a day. It can't happen that way. It has to be something that's a true belief, and that we work hard to send messages in all kinds of ways throughout the school year, that we really do value those things.
Yeah, and I think, Laurie, I think we have to be careful just to say, charts, we don't want to do that. But I think you're right, because I think you give them the opportunity to back into that. It's like, oh, we just did this, or I just did this. So that's a place for them to come back and connect to. Now I get what she was talking about, or I think I just did this. What do you think? So I think that.
Yeah, and I had to refer to it all the time. That chart had to be
Absolutely.
referred to all the time.
Which can be its own kind of routine in terms
Right.
of, oh, there we go. I see this is happening
It's like
to.
when that teacher you talked about celebrated her, saying, "Oh, I see it this way now."
Yes, exactly, exactly. So it's as long as you're backing up, because that's what I
Right.
think of all the schools we worked in, and those posters were just meaningless after the first introduction of them,
Yeah.
and not going to reflect back.
I love that. And I wish that's something that I would have done. If I would have seen somebody do that, I would have loved to do that. I would have copied them, copied the effort, not necessarily the literal values. But I think what a great way to communicate and involve your students in your values, because I think
My first one, by the way, was we can do more and learn more when we work together.
mhm,
And when I think of No Adam and I think of like Judy, that competition thing, I was so big on that, not creating a competition, but learning from each other because we all have so much to add.
Yeah.
That was what I started with every year. And when we did challenges, it wasn't like, oh, I think when we used to make the electric cars.
mhm,
It wasn't about, oh, my car went the farthest, my car went the fastest. It was collectively, what can we learn from this and how can we apply what we're learning so that we can all be successful? Huge,
mhm,
huge.
mhm.
Yeah.
And what I love about that as well is that it gives the students a chance to call you out.
Mm.
And
True.
I think that's important. One of the things I used to love about, and I always knew I was hitting my stride in the year with my classes, when students would come to checkpoints, they'd be creating their labs and I'd ask them questions, and they would ask me a question back. Like what, like, sometimes, it would, and I'm trying to think of a quick for instance, but um, basically they saw my thinking as potentially flawed as theirs sometimes, and they would be respectful, but then ask me things like, well, why wouldn't that be related to to this question? Like, why wouldn't that be relevant to this question? I might ask them like, well, how's that relevant to your question? And they would say, well, how could it not be? and and they weren't being fresh, but they really were sort of almost treating me a little bit as an intellectual peer. And what that said to me is that they were really listening and considering my thinking alongside theirs, but realizing that I had flaws in my thinking and that I also valued their input on my thinking and on the things we were talking about in class, because I was also open to changing my viewpoint or to thinking about things differently. And so I could think about my students, if I had a poster like that on my wall that showed my values and the things that I care about as a teacher, and that we had discussions about what those things meant, and that every day I was reinforcing those things, that when I didn't do that, that they would turn around and say, but you know what, we value mistakes. Why are you giving me a hard time for making this mistake? And
Yeah.
I can see that, but I think that this also brings up something really important, I think, from mindset one, where we talked about schools being cultures of thinking for teachers if we want classrooms to be cultures of thinking for students. And I had a conversation with a friend of mine, Scott Morrison. Dr. Morrison's a specialist in school safety and so on. And we talked about a concept called tethering. And he said, that he wants to make sure that every adult and child in his school district is tethered to somebody, that the children are not untethered in the classroom, that they're like a rock climber, that when they come to school, that they are tethered to their teacher, that click, that they have a relationship, a connection that they know they can lean on, and that they develop. And I think, well, it's the same for teachers. You want teachers tethered to their principal, right? And what are we tethering along? We're tethering along the lines of the things that we value and the things that we honor. So it's that I think about those administrators coming back and looking at a classroom that might be somewhat chaotic, that doesn't have the standard on the board, but where these really rich discussions and questioning and reflection are happening. If those are the things that we value as a culture in our school, as a way of learning, thinking as a way of learning, then the teachers are going to tether to that. If I champion that as an administrator, because if they're not tethered to it, then the culture of our building is not going to be one that matches what they value, and they're going to ultimately go elsewhere. As a teacher, it's not going to be a place that they want to be. So again, they may not even take the job, and that might be a good thing, because if you want a culture of thinking of you in your school, you don't want to hire a bunch of people who don't value thinking. Vice versa, when it comes to the classroom, I think about the kind of things you're talking about, Lori, that you would have on the wall of your classroom. We want kids tethering to us, seeing that those are things that they can rely on when they come to our school, as a way, into my classroom, as a way of learning, as a way of being treated, as a sort of culture of teaching and learning. And so that as a result, they're going to form relationships in their lives that also mirror those sort of things: listening, valuing others' opinions, going below the surface. And so I think that kind of speaks to these two questions. And the first one's almost more of a reflection question. I think if you're listening to this discussion, you might want to pause and just reflect on what messages about learning, how it happens, and what counts am I in my school sending? Because those could be two very different things. It depends on who's tethered to what, and how strong those tethers are, and if there is tethering going on. And then what dispositions do I value, and how am I communicating that to my students? And I think that it goes, to your point, Lori, beyond what's on the wall. It's how am I communicating it through my actions, the activities? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think that brings us to, if this isn't our last slide, very close to it. Culture is about messages sent. These messages demonstrate what's valued, what's important, what people do around here to fit in, to be accepted, and to be rewarded. The culture of a school then might have very little to do with its goals or mission statement, which are largely aspirational. And to your point, Lori, and I know that was my case in the first school I taught in, just be a paragraph on the wall in 12-point font that we might be able to memorize and spit back if we were asked by somebody, but otherwise is kind of external. I guess in wrapping things up here, a reflection question for folks who are listening to this is, how can we uncover the true culture of a school? How does one begin to shift the true culture of a school from a disconnected aspirational goal to a lived vision? I think that might warrant a couple minutes just to reflect here. How do you uncover the culture of a school? I know, Judy, you talked about learning walks a little earlier today.
Yeah.
I think even beyond a learning walk, you could just spend 2 seconds in a hallway, and having been a person that's traveled to lots of different schools, just listening and watching, even in the hallway, you learn so much, never mind going deep in a classroom. I think it's revealed very quickly.
And I think the book calls those ghost walks.
Yes.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and also I think about a school where I was that celebrated perfect attendance. Now, this was a school where students at very young ages parents were off at work. Sometimes parents worked 2 and 3 jobs and were gone, sometimes overnight. Very young students were expected to get themselves to school alone.
So unfair.
So unfair. And And I remember, like, we're celebrating perfect attendance. Are you kidding?
About effort.
Some of these kids they're lucky if they get to school. So
Right.
obviously, those students, they saw the culture. I don't matter. Nothing I can do matters. And when we started having conversations about celebrating curiosity, I was curious today. Thinking about things again, like looking at abilities. Do these students have the ability to get themselves to school when one time they might be living with this aunt, another time they're, living on another side of town? Let's really think about what is the culture of this school. And of course it matters getting to school, but do they have that? We go back to that ability. And let's think about if we want a culture of thinking. And to think about, I remember one school talking about they would give tickets, they'd sort of catch kids doing something great. And we had done a training that sort of talked about normalizing struggle. And it was so much fun when we started having a conversation about, parents are terrified. What? My kid is struggling? What's wrong? Oh my gosh, what do I do? Kids looked down upon that. And when suddenly we rebranded struggling, and I just got a ticket because I struggled. And it's so exciting because I think so often schools would sort of say, well, I thought that's what we were doing. Well, let's really look at it. So I think those are really good questions that sometimes what the school says. And again, Laurie, it goes back to your making the chart where this is what I'm saying. And here's how I'm constantly revisiting it and pointing it out and modeling it and calling it out. So we're all seeing the same thing together, as opposed to I'm just, I don't matter because I don't have good attendance. And I don't ever see that happening where I am.
Struck such a chord, Judy.
Yeah.
The whole reward system. When you think about culture and really what you're like, is rewarding kids with something tangible. We used to give out a good citizenship award, and I fought year after year after year to get rid of it. I had to pick one student that was the best citizen. Like, what message is that sending to the other kids in my class that also deserved the reward? And for some kids, the amount of effort they have to put in to be a good citizen.
Yes.
Compared to the other student that maybe isn't as good of a citizen, but is trying 10 times harder to be a good citizen, who has that rough home life, or like, oh, just that whole thing, you just struck a chord, sorry.
It's one of the many things that I loved about this chapter is kind of calling those things out. Is that, we have this and looking for those disconnects and what is it that we really want? And, it's the whole, it's much of the problem with education in terms of, looking at, for a disposition, we have to make sure, do they have the ability to do that? And let's stop that.
And does an external reward promote that? No. No, it does not.
Right. Well, and I think, Judy, as you say, ability, I almost would like to rebrand that as opportunity. It's, I think about that. I don't have time to tell the whole story, but I had a situation myself where I lived an hour from my middle school, and if there was any form of weather, we got out the door late or whatever, and a single parent family, blah, 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 lots of complexity to my situation growing up. But the long and short of it is that I ended up with so many detentions from being late, like by 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever, for this sort of a policy, that it actually, I think it reinforced sort of a disregard for the rules and really thinking like it was a joke. And it like, imagine that, like my mom had to drive us an hour to school, and like I couldn't drive. I had nothing to do with the traffic, like all these sort of things, but yet I end up in detention because you're allowed.
And think of your attitude toward that, Francis, and what could have been done different with an administrator through a conversation, you know,
Mhm.
or just understanding and empathy that that was your situation, you
Right,
know,
right,
and how different that would have sat with you.
right,
And how maybe more, you would have put more effort into getting there through empathy and understanding than
right,
punishment.
right, right. And that's the thing. And so as a student who was a middle schooler at that point, you start to sort of you see yourself as branded as like a slacker or a lazy person
Yeah.
or something like, again, I have nothing. So then, well, if that's, it's very easy for a middle school student to take on the image that others project onto them as well, which is
Message sent.
yeah, sent and received,
Yeah.
and then you inhabit that. So again, you think about people who have behavior problems in the classroom, and it's, and I don't want to say that every behavior problem is the result of, something a teacher's doing, but if you don't expect a student to be able to contribute and you treat them in such a way that removes their agency and the opportunity, the dignity, the respect, the reward for contributing by dumbing something down because you don't expect, or sitting them in a certain place because you don't, making them work by themselves because you don't expect that they're going to work well with others. All you're doing is putting something on that child, which they can fight it, but you're a bigger person, or they can inhabit it, in which case you now have a much, much bigger problem.
I
So
visited
go
I
ahead.
visited a school where I was a visiting member. I wasn't a part of the school, and I was in a classroom, and another teacher from another room came in because a kid was misbehaving, brought him into that classroom to sit in the corner, talked loudly to the teacher. The whole class stopped so she could say all the terrible things he was doing in her classroom, and he was going to come and watch this classroom to see what models look like.
Mhm.
And I just thought, wow, so what message is that student getting, instead of a private conversation and being shunned and shamed in front of all those kids. Think about the culture of that school.
Exactly. Well, and I think just to directly answer these questions so we can move on to our last slide, is that I think that how we can uncover the true culture of a school is to not sugarcoat anything, and to just, as best we can with wide eyes, look at what's there. And if that's a ghost walk, and I notice this oftentimes when if I go on a ghost walk through the hallways and I see very perfect bulletin boards where every child has the same exact product of something that's there, and so on and so forth, the level of organization and the level of conformity that I'm seeing sometimes in those moments can cause a level of concern for me, because I think, well, it's great that everything's here, everything's well organized, and this is the class, but where's the opportunity to be different? What happens when something doesn't conform? That's what I start to wonder. And then in the classroom, I think about the same sort of thing on a learning walk. It's like, in the classroom, how much anxiety, how much teacher direction is there? How much student direction? How far can a student wander in their questioning? How far can a student um, how different can a student be in their thinking or in their results? Is there, because again, I come back to that opportunity, dignity, respect, and reward. Is there opportunity for thinking? Is there opportunity to be authentic? Because if there isn't, that sort of implies something about how we dignify difference or diversity in thinking, and so on and so forth. And again, these are just uncovering things. It doesn't mean that, um, that what might be implied or what might be potentially happening is actually happening, but looking at what's there is clues, and is sort of the foundation for asking questions and looking deeper and reflecting more, I think. And then how we talked a lot about this in Mindset One. How does one begin to shift the true culture of a school from a connected aspirational goal to something that's an actual lived vision. And I think we talked about this in the last mindset, that it's about having discussions about what we as teachers in our school value and trying to generate a vision or a set of goals for ourselves as teachers, but also what's shared so that we can connect around those and tether to them in a sense.
Yeah. Work backwards, as they say in the book.
I'm sorry, you said, or what?
They said he calls it back to the future, you know, envisioning it and then working your way back.
Exactly.
Sort of like a backward design.
Exactly, because if so much energy goes into, and I've seen this before too, if so much energy goes into keeping some toothpicks off the floor, what if we could put that energy someplace else and sort of let a couple of toothpicks be on the floor? Like, do we get more out of teaching and learning for that? Because I feel like that Back to the Future identify the values and the vision and then work towards it. We can then let some things go in favor of things that maybe have more to do with teaching and learning, and we don't have to feel judged. And I think that's another thing. I think that sometimes when we don't identify what we value as a team and tether to those things, we can feel judged by things that don't matter, like the toothpicks. So this, I think, is a good spot to end here, where in the book on page 48, Ron Ritchhart mentions that he spoke to a colleague whose child had gone to a school that Ritchhart had done a lot of work with, professional development on thinking and making thinking cultures in classrooms in the School of Culture of Thinking. And he relays the story where the mother asks the student, her child, what his new school is like. What's it like to be there? And this is what he says. He responded that the kids at his new school just see more. He said, it doesn't matter what we're looking at. It can be a poem in English or an experiment we're doing in science or even in phys ed. When we go to talk about it, the kids just see so much more. They notice things, and not just the easy things you would expect. So I love that, because it's in the student's own words, seeing more. And I guess this is our closing question, is how does looking closely and going deep become a student's default behavior in every subject when we enculturate these dispositions?
I loved this quote so much. I underlined this so many times because I think that's when you know you've done it, when a student can articulate that in such a powerful way. But I think this question is so great because there's a lot behind that. There's a lot that, how does it become students' default behavior? We have to provide those opportunities. And we all talked about things like picture thinking a lot, that they have that opportunity to notice and wonder. We talked a lot about discourse.
Wait, why am I talking?
Yes. And well, and again, going to letting them have the opportunity of talking to each other and stumbling through things and asking questions, but again, giving them the support, because that was one of those that hit me like a brick with thinking about, you have to help them know how to ask questions. And that was, when I sort of finally started realizing the power of things like sentence frames, that just released everything that I had to help my students understand. It wasn't a natural thing for everyone. Yes, it is when you're 2 and 3 years old. It's as natural as can be, but we know what, there's plenty of data that shows every year students are asking less and less questions. So being able to open that door up and make time. So there's a lot that goes behind that we have to think about in terms of ability and helping them value things enough that they're curious and not creating anxiety so their brain is working, which is a big one.
I think about a quote from Making Thinking Visible, or The Power of Making Thinking Visible, where deeper learning is defined as the intersection between creativity, identity, and mastery.
Mm.
And I think about this quote in this child's, and even our whole discussion today. It's about creating an environment where the culture creates the opportunity, but supports and honors authentic engagement with real things, real ideas, and creates an opportunity for students to develop mastery of the standards by processing what they're seeing together individually in different ways, but also to create things that are personally meaningful. That and that can be an explanation, that can be a connection. It doesn't just have to be an experiment or a prototype. I mean, thankfully in NoAtom, we have that too. But creating something that's personally meaningful, to Lori's earlier comment, gives students skin in the game. It actually helps them to use these dispositions to develop mastery of those standards. But then I think also that third piece of identity, I think that similar to my story earlier, being identified as the student who always shows up late, the slacker, the whatever, that's not the identity we want to champion. We don't want to put that on students. Like students, especially early on, they're not adults. They can absorb identity from their environment in some senses. And what we want them to be able to do is to develop an identity within the discipline to see that they have the power to influence the world around them. And that as adults, we value their thinking. And we see value in sharing agency, creating a space for that. And I think that that's really at the root of all of it, is these sort of three things. And when we do that, I think that the student Max, I think that this is what kids see. And I think what's nice about that is, and I always wonder when I think about, I go into a class on a learning walk and I just see the kind of environments where deeper learning is really happening, that intersection of mastery, identity, and creativity really playing out in this culture of thinking. My gosh, what would it be like if we just took any student and dropped them in that room? What would they think, and how would they behave, and how would their future change? Because I guess my hypothesis is that they would become a member of that community like all the members that I see. And so that's why we need more of these types of cultures at a school level and at a classroom level.
Agree.
For sure.
So with that said, I don't know if there's anything else that either of you would like to leave us with. Oops, be happy to wrap this up.
I think we covered a lot.
We did cover a lot of ground today. So I just want to say thank you to everyone who took the time to sit in on this conversation. I hope that you found it engaging and maybe some food for thought. And again, perhaps a reason to jump in and take a look at Mindset 2. We can't directly teach dispositions, but we must enculturate them in cultures of thinking and action. I'm Francis Vigent, and my colleagues Lori Colpoys and Judy Higgins. You're welcome to check out NoAtom's resources and supports. We have a lot of different visuals and anchor charts and things for thinking routines, as well as the other mindsets that we'll be discussing by going to noatom.com. And you can also connect with us on X, formerly known as Twitter, at NoAtom's our handle, and facebook.com/NoAtom. Thank you again, and good luck in your journey.